We are a few minutes late, but hopefully we can catch up as folks come in. We are welcome to the monthly seminar hosted by the Hague Program on International Cybersecurity at Leiden University. We are delighted to have Scott Shackelford of Indiana University join us today to talk about his book. Let me, before I hand it over to Scott, give you a sense of what the seminar is to those people who are perhaps joining us for the first time. This fall, so the monthly seminar usually brings researchers who are presenting a new or recent book to talk about some more detail, talk about the book in some more detail, to people who have read the book and want to engage with it further, and in many cases, people who then sort of go on to buy and read the book. So it's a good opportunity for authors to sort of engage the wider community of scholars and practitioners. And this semester, in the fall this year, we've had a bunch of interesting discussions. This is, Scott, the last monthly seminar the last seminar that we will host this year. Before you, in September, we had Richard Harknett talk about his co-authored book on cyber persistence theory. In October, we had Lucas Kello at Oxford speak about his book, his new book on striking back the end of cyber peace and how to restore it. We were supposed to have Biljana Lilly in November talking about Russian information warfare, but we couldn't organize it for reasons of scheduling, and she couldn't make it. And so instead we've moved that seminar to January. So the seminar with Biljana will happen on the 26th of January at exactly this time for those who are interested in joining. And we have you for December. So Scott is a professor of business law and ethics at the Indiana University Kelley School of Business. He is also the executive director of the Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research at the school, as well as the executive director of the Ostrom Workshop. If you have been engaged in international law debates, particularly as I have had the privilege of interacting with Scott for a long period of time, and I'm sure we will benefit from learning more about his book, which I think was published in March 2020, after which a lot has happened in this world. So I'm also curious to know how you present your thesis, or whether you've gone back to your thesis and sort of thought about revisiting it in the advent of the pandemic, and how it has been in many ways a transformative event for cybersecurity as well. The book is called Governing New Frontiers in the Information Age Towards Cyber Peace. So how we're thinking about organizing this, Scott, is perhaps you could hold the fort for 20 to 25 minutes, after which we can open it up for discussion. Does that sound good?
That sounds great, Arun. Thank you so much for that kind
introduction.
You're too kind. But and thanks as well to you, Corey, and apologies for being a few minutes late here. As I was mentioning, I was finishing up a course, and there were some good questions from students, so it was tough to jump out on time. But thank you for your patience. As I said, honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Let me share just a few highlights. Let me get this pulled up. And in advance, let me say that I'm happy to share this deck, with you, Arun, anybody else who might be interested. And we can talk more about this during Q&A, but I'll put up a link in the chat. Cambridge had asked to do a little reflection on, to your point, Arun, how the situation has changed, especially given the war in Ukraine. And since this book came out, we did another edited volume, the first edited volume on cyber peace that came out in, I want to say, May or June of this year. So this was an effort from not only me, but the other co-editors. So Frédéric Douzet at Paris 8, and then Chris Ankerson at NYU as well. We all collaborated on kind of reflecting a little bit given recent developments. So would love thoughts. And like I said, we can dig more into that during Q&A. So I promise to keep this very brief. As a result, it's going to be a pretty high level survey. Let me just note up front that I do have the privilege of directing those two research centers. And I would love to answer any questions any of you might have about either one. has a lot of affiliates, for example, in Europe. We just had a wonderful gathering of all of our EU-based, or a lot of our EU-based affiliates in Berlin at the IU Berlin Gateway in September. And this coming year marks the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Ostrom Workshop. And we'll be having a lot of events, including at the IASC conference in Kenya, leading up to the next really big workshop on the workshop in June of 24. So if you're interested in the commons, not only on internet governance and cybersecurity issues, but kind of broader issues of global commons governance as well, you're more than welcome. The last thing I'll mention is a very active visiting scholars program. So we regularly have, roughly around 20, 25 visiting scholars come through the workshop in a given year. A lot of folks focusing on cybersecurity, including practitioners. We just had the lead, for example, of Microsoft's global cyber policy team spend a month with us. So we'd love to host you as well. Just shoot me an email following this and happy to chat more about it. And you can get on any of these lists that you might be interested in, like the working groups on critical infrastructure protection, cyber peace, blockchain governance, AI governance might be of interest. I also direct CACR. Really briefly, that's much more operational, though the research hook here, I think that could be of interest to some of you, is we're just starting 302 cyber assessments over the next 4 years that we're doing in collaboration with Purdue. Every county in my home state of Indiana, every major city, and most of the major towns will get one of these assessments. And it's a really, frankly, kind of a gold mine in terms of a data set looking at municipal governance and cybersecurity. So it's going to be open to researchers. I would love to engage in conversations about how you might be interested in developing, more qualitative case studies, as well as some trend analyses based on that data as it comes available over the next few years. We'll skip over that. That's just a program that I head up as well. A lot of new initiatives we can talk about too, including, if any of you are interested, we're still accepting submissions for this next edited volume on defending democracy in the digital age. That I'm doing with Frederick and Chris, but also Michael McRobbie, who is the former president of IU. And it's going to be a really interesting look at both cyber-enabled threats to election infrastructure, as well as efforts to manage misinformation and disinformation around the world. Okay, so to the topic of today, given our limited time, this is kind of my cyber peace trilogy, as it were. I'm still waiting on the movie rights for that, but I first started writing on this topic when I was exposed to the ideas of positive peace. I spent a term at Notre Dame and got interested in it there. At the time, most of the effort, most of the attention was looking at cyber war. I myself was working on a book on cyber war at the time, and I got interested in flipping that paradigm, thinking about, well, what's the best we can hope for in terms of peace on the internet? How can we leverage the ideas of positive peace to inform some of the debates that are going on? And that's been operationalized in a lot of different ways over the years since then. And I'll try to talk about some of them now, but we'll probably have more time during Q&A to really dig into it if folks are interested, including, I think, some of the wonderful contributions as part of this edited volume, because there's a whole community that's being built up around these concepts now, which is really gratifying to see, because that was not the case a few years ago. Needless to say, guys, we're going to really skim over this in the interest of time. Cyber attacks have been around for quite some time now. I usually tell the story of the Morris worm, but as many of you know, they've been around even longer. We're actually working on a book called Forks in the Digital Road, key decisions that gave us the internet we have. And I'm doing it with a guy named Scott Bradner, who used to be the CISO at Harvard before he retired. And he was really in the room where it happened, as it were, around a lot of these key decision points around, for example, encryption and TCP/IP. Should the post office treat regular email as mail and regulate it as a result? What led to Section 230 in the US? What could have been different there? So there's a lot of fun kind of what if questions baked into a lot of that. But cyber attacks are clearly a part of it, only getting more complicated because of the rapidly expanding Internet of Things and because of the geopolitics of the moment, including, of course, Ukraine, which we could spend the whole rest of the session, I think, talking about. That link that I offered at the beginning is a specific reflection of the impacts, I think the myriad impacts on the war in Ukraine, not only on, of course, unfortunately, civilians, critical infrastructure providers in Ukraine itself, but also on the broader movement towards cyber norms development, and even more broadly, this idea of cyber peace. So again, would love to hear reactions to that. And I would also be happy to chat, more about it during Q&A. We've tried to get a better sense for how some of these big trends are playing out closer to home. This is talked about in the new edited volume on cyber peace, but this hadn't been out when I did that book in 2020. But just in brief, this is the first ever state level snapshot for how a U.S. state is doing on cybersecurity. It's called State of Hoosier Cybersecurity 2020. That was the report that we did. But some of the key findings we just put into a new article that's coming out in the Yale Journal of Law and Technology on defining reasonable cybersecurity. So I'll put up a link to that in a few minutes too. But it's an interesting data set to take a look at. It's classic good news, bad news. If you can call it good news, lots more organizations are concerned about it than used to be the case. It turned out that it was less likely that critical infrastructure providers had been breached. You can tell there about a difference of 15% in terms of the number of breaches. In terms of the types of attacks experienced in this data set here in Indiana. Phishing, very common, wire fraud, very common, ransomware was as well, but these data were collected right before the pandemic hit in 2020. So it'll be really interesting to see how these attitudes and practices have changed in the meantime, including, I'm really keeping a close eye on this one of insurance coverage, given how quickly the costs of insurance have escalated and the number of exclusions. I just did a piece on the act of war and hostile acts exclusion in an article called War Games. There's actually on a panel in New York about that last week. So if any of you guys are interested in how kind of insurance and these ideas of international law and attribution are now very, very much, coming together and impacting the bottom lines of firms, happy to chat more about that too. And I think this is where we in academia and the civil society have a big role to play, because the number one reason about why organizations didn't do more to protect themselves is they were unsure where to put that next euro or that next dollar of investment, right? Do you put it in multi-factor, cyber hygiene, end-to-end encryption, you name it. So there's a lot more there to define these ideas of reasonable cybersecurity and cyber peace, which is the core focus of this book. In terms of the methodologies and the concepts that I use, this started life actually as my PhD dissertation way back in the day at Cambridge. So I had never published it, at least as a standalone volume. It very purposely and initially did not even talk about cybersecurity. At the same time that I was starting this PhD, I had a book deal to do a separate book on cybersecurity based on an earlier article. So this was about everything else, basically the other global commons. So, space, the oceans, climate, Antarctica. But when I revisited it and decided I should really do something with this finally, I tried to tease out lessons from each of these global commons frontiers of international relations and apply them back to some contemporary issues in internet governance and cybersecurity. So the front end of the book is really focused on exactly that. What are some of the animating concepts around the types of goods, et cetera, around the different methodologies, the frameworks that the Ostrom Workshop is known for and otherwise, and how might they be useful in helping us think through these challenges in global commons governance. Lynn Ostrom herself, for example, toward the very end of her career, focused a lot on the issue of climate change and polycentricity. So I tried to use some of those same topics to think about contemporary issues in cybersecurity. So this is where that is coming from. Depending, of course, on the level of analysis and governance that you're interested in, cyberspace really could be any of these things, right? From personal devices, club goods, all the way, of course, even if you think about cybersecurity as being a public good akin to national security. So I try to tease that out a little bit in the book, go through these different global common spaces, highlighting some of the similarities and differences between them, and the direct cybersecurity implications for things like submarine cables under UNCLOS, right? What peaceful use means in Antarctica, basically no military personnel. That's pretty different, for example, than outer space, where just nukes are banned, but you can still do things like launch cyber attacks, right? We also go through some of the fun of trying to define some key terms, and I try to do that through some non-traditional sources, including Cisco had this chart, which I found really interesting about how different countries around the world even define cyberspace, right? So go through the whole history from Neuromancer kind of to the present of efforts to do that. And we really see that we're all over the map, right? About whether we should think about this as an extension of national territory, a global network commons, to use Hillary Clinton's phrase, something in between the two, which really ties into these issues of internet governance and how the internet itself has evolved over this time period. We do have a book That's in a very early stage of development on the metaverse and Web 3.0. So I don't really focus very much on that in this particular book, but I do try to tie in some of those key pivot points in Web 1 and 2.0 to these bigger issues of global commons governance that we can return to. And I try to do things with regime complex literature, complexity, and polycentric governance to kind of think through, well, where can we be doing better? What lessons can we learn, for example, from the climate context and the Paris process, and apply those to something like cybersecurity, right? Could you have something like the announcements ahead of each major COP saying, hey, here's what each country is doing in terms of emissions reductions? Could you just do something like that for a cyber peace or cybersecurity more specifically, saying we're doing X, Y, and Z that can help build momentum if you have smaller bilateral or regional groups that can help along the same vein? This is showing Joe Nye's effort to map all of those different stakeholders a few years ago. And I try in the book to do a little bit with updating that to the present. And also try to think through how the unique nature of cyberspace in some ways maps on to these existing frameworks, and in other ways really test them to the breaking point. So the Ostrom Workshop, for example, is famous for developing this institutional analysis and development framework that Lynn and many others worked on. This is a really valuable tool in social sciences to get us on the same page. And it's been updated to look at knowledge commons through the governing knowledge commons framework. So I do a little bit with that, especially this underappreciated and frankly underdeveloped box of evaluative criteria, which is the only normative piece of this, right? Of thinking through not only mapping out where are we today, but where do we want to head? And that normative piece of where we want to head is really where this notion of cyber peace comes into play. But I also try to look at these issues of the overriding forces of science and technology, of resource scarcity and demand for services, and ultimately geopolitics, feeding into each of these global common spaces, whether we're talking about space or cyberspace. As I mentioned, I think polycentricity has some useful lessons here as well, especially around the importance of communication, begetting coordination, begetting ultimately the potential for confidence building and trust, which, as Lynn famously said, is the most important resource. And this is where a lot of polycentric systems fail. One of the former directors of the Ostrom Workshop, Mike McGinnis, who just recently retired, is working on a new book around looking at polycentricity in the US healthcare system, because that's a system that's very polycentric in nature, but obviously has not produced, shall we say, optimal results. And we're trying to get a better answer as to why, right? And then I think we can ask some interesting questions for how cyberspace and internet governance, for example, is similar to or different from those other areas. I also do a little bit in the first part of the book with the design principles that Lynn created for and finally distilled in her 1990 book, Governing the Commons. Some of these, again, apply in interesting ways as we think about cybersecurity in particular, and others are a bit of a stretch, shall we say. I spend a lot of time in particular talking about nested governance and the importance of graduated sanctions. Okay, and then before I close here, because I promise I won't take this too long, these are just some of the core findings and some of my efforts to try to tease out regime effectiveness. And as all of you, I'm sure are aware, it's really tough to do that in a useful and eventually convincing way, I think. We just don't have enough, frankly, hard data sets to ask questions about, all right, well, this state or this country is taking this approach around, for example, IoT security, whatever it might be, that's leading to X, fewer cyber attacks, or it's bending the curve in this or that way. Because we're still at such an early stage, it's tough to draw a lot of those connections. So I try to use at least the tools that we have at our disposal, including the design principles, to think through them in some hopefully interesting ways. So this is an effort to do that in the context of IoT, with some of the better known efforts in the EU, the US, and otherwise these days to help us think through each of these criteria. Also look at the major treaties, right? So both in these other global commons contexts, including climate, as well as in cyberspace, to try to get a feel for, well, what have been the more successful agreements over time, like the Montreal Protocol, right? First agreement ever to get to universal, basically consensus, and did more than Kyoto to reduce emissions. Why, right? Really different for a variety of reasons, including, frankly, a much smaller number of countries that were emitting these CFCs. There were clear alternatives available. really different from, for example, the climate change context and efforts to reduce carbon, methane, and other sources. So, different too, but I think there's still some lessons that can be teased out, including this much more polycentric structure of Paris, which I think is some of the secret sauce for why that agreement broke through the logjam. And this is again showing some of that just in terms of the number of months it took for them to enter into force. For the oceans as well, I think it's kind of interesting to look at just the explosion in national regulation. This is one of those themes that is played out across this particular Governing New Frontiers book, is just the increase of interest both from nations as well as the private sector, right? And we're seeing that, play out in the cyber context with the increasing number of, for example, data localization laws, censorship laws. I'm thinking of, Russia's internet sovereignty laws being one example of many these days for how that's playing out. But we shouldn't ignore the fact that similar trends are happening in other global commons, including the oceans and including space. There's even some interesting questions there around corporate sovereigns as we see, Starlink explode, SpaceX's plans for, Mars, for example. There's some interesting, case studies, I think, to be done. In fact, one of my postdocs is doing this right now, looking at, for example, the East India Tea Company, looking at lessons there for how the development of some of these resources could, or hopefully we don't have to repeat history there, proceed. Similarly in space, right? So again, these are all from data from the USA site, the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs, but we've seen a real uptick in efforts in the US and otherwise to regulate space, which is in some ways a reaction to the fact that a lot of these UN bodies, like the Committee for the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space or the Continental Shelf Delimitation Commission, are just frankly overwhelmed with a number of requests. And because of the need for consensus, it's meant that, like it or not, we're moving toward this increasingly polycentric system of a lot more regional groupings, a lot more bilateral groupings to address these global collective action challenges. And that's one thing I'm really interested in anyways. How can we ensure, if that is the direction we're heading, that we can still result in a system that minimizes, gridlock, overlap, because as we know, there's no panaceas, as Lynn also famously said, and certainly polycentricity is not one of them. We've seen similar results though in outer space, right? There was this golden age. The Moon Treaty really ended that when it failed in the U.S. Senate, and we haven't had a major multilateral treaty since, right? We have had a lot more, national laws. We have had new accords like Artemis, which has been really interesting. We actually just had the lead attorney at NASA speaking about Artemis a few weeks ago at the workshop. Those are all available on our YouTube channel if you're interested. We even got into some cybersecurity discussions of space, which I think is a lot of fun. But as a result, we're left to rely increasingly on codes of conduct and on these minilateral groupings. And you can see that directly correlates with the number of states ratifying each of these accords. I think there's a lot of implications, and I'll wind up here from all of these different global commons arenas as we think about some of these big issues in cybersecurity and internet governance more broadly, as well as this drive for cyber peace. And I just listed a couple of them on this in the next few slides. We can talk more about any of them if you're interested. But one idea in the climate context has gotten a lot of attention, especially given the last COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, is the common but differentiated responsibilities notion. And then a few articles looking at sustainable cybersecurity, what that could mean. I think it's interesting to ask those same questions as we're asking in the climate context when it comes to cybersecurity, especially these overarching questions of due diligence. As we said, a lot more of these clubs, some are coordinated, some aren't. There's some really interesting, I think, mapping that should be done as a result. We're doing some of that in the space context now through this Carnegie Corporation grant that we received. There's a big database now of up to a couple thousand actors, which are active in space. And we're in the process right now by looking at their contractual relationships to try to identify the major nodes or kind of norm entrepreneurs. And I think we could do a lot more of that in the cyber context, which could be really hopefully interesting and maybe even enlightening. A lot of other issues, I'll just kind of try to mention some of them here. So, again, gosh, we could spend the rest of the time on all these. Just in brief, all of these are stretched. I don't think there's any perfect analogies as we look at, cybersecurity here. Each of these global common spaces is unique. There are some, legal concepts that we can talk more about if you guys are interested, like the common heritage concept that's in large part been repackaged as this notion of, sustainable development, though not exclusively repackaged. And I think it's interesting to see and kind of learn from that history. I do a lot of that. I think it's in chapter 2 of this book, looking back at that long notion as it appears in the seabed context, even in the Moon Treaty, and trying to understand, well, what does that mean for, modern international organizations like the International Seabed Authority and our efforts to rethink internet governance? Very different ideas around regulatory ripples. Again, we can talk more about all this stuff. I don't want to go on for too long here, but in short, if you see a concept or an idea that you're just kind of intrigued by, let me know. Let's return back to it, okay? And we can unpack it more during Q&A. I think this is the last one. A lot of critical infrastructure these days. That's still very much in the eye of the beholder. In the EU, there's a new NIST directive that's going to be coming out, right? That's going to be defining this in a new way, which I think is long overdue and really exciting, but still really different from the US, right? In the US, there's 16 of these critical infrastructure sectors. So we can talk more about that, including some new approaches in Talon 3.0, which could be of interest as well. And I'm seeing some repeats there. So yeah, anyway, we'll, instead of kind of talking about cyber peace in the interest of time, I think let's just wind it up there. If folks are kind of interested in how this work fits in to the kind of overarching ideas around cyber peace that we've been kind of working on, happy to talk more about that. I can cue some of this other content back up. But for the time being, I'll just kind of wind up there and just thank you again so much for the opportunity to go through some of this together. It's been very much, a group effort from the beginning, and would love to hear your questions or ideas for how we could work better together. So thank you so much.